Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss the topic Philosophy of Education, School of Thought, specifically Analytic Philosophy of Education and the concept of liberal education. What is Analytic philosophy? Character and history. The label Analytic or Anglo-American philosophy is used in contrast with the label Continental or European philosophy. These labels designate two main traditions of thought in contemporary Western philosophy. This is not a deep philosophical contrast but a conventional and sometimes contested distinction that roughly separate two ways of doing philosophy on the opposite sides of the English Channel and Atlantic Ocean. Both traditions started around 1900s. The continental one with E. Husserl's book Logische Untersuchungen 1900s to 1901, and the analytic one with G. E. Moore's article The Refutation of Idealism 1903. Analytic philosophy has its origins in British empiricism and American pragmatism, whereas continental philosophy is rooted in the German idealism of Kant and Hegel as well as the critical philosophy of Marx and Nietzsche. Although the labels analytic and continental might be misleading and tendentious, they nonetheless broadly indicate two different styles of doing philosophy. While continental philosophy tends to engage directly with existential concerns, cultural critique, and prospects for emancipation, analytic philosophy is disposed to occupy itself primarily with language, logic, and science, somewhat exaggerated. One can say that the first movement copes with the meaning of life, whereas the second deals with the wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, the scientific conception of the world. One can add that continental writing is often much more literary in exposing sweeping hypotheses and deconstructing grand theories, and that analytic writing, in contrast, is mostly literal and logically rigorous in arguing or limited conclusions. Again, somewhat overstated, there is much more tolerance of cognitive vagueness and emotive persuasion in the continental than in the analytic tradition. Yet, the distinction between these two traditions is perhaps not really fruitful, and we should not lay too much weight on such a polarized view of philosophical schools. So there are four periods in the history of analytic philosophy. First, the 1900s to 1930 logical analysis. Second, the 1930 to 1945 logical positivism or empiricism. Third, 1945 to 1960 ordinary language philosophy. And the last one is 1960 to today pluralist or electric analysis. So the period of direct relevance to analytic philosophy of education is the third one. After some general remarks about analytic philosophy and its first two periods, I will focus on the methodology of this post-war period. The most general characterization of analytic philosophy is that it is the philosophy which took the linguistic turn. Analytic philosophy turns from the objects and phenomena to the way we think and talk about them as the primary subject matter of study. Philosophical questions are questions of language, since semantics and not syntax is of primary interest. Analytic investigation often do not distinguish between the words, example, cat and dog, and the concepts cat and dog. Until 1960, analytic philosophy is synonymous with linguistic philosophy. Analytic philosophers approach problems against the background of either the ideal or artificial language of logic or the ordinary or natural language of speakers and hearers, and then tried to dissolve these problems by the method of logical or ordinary language analysis. The initial period built on the new developments in mathematical logic during the 19th century. Logical analysis decomposes the surface structure or grammar of a sentence into the distinct elements of its depth structure or logic. The logical form of a potentially misleading sentence, such as Russell's example sentence, "The present King of France is bald," can be laid bare by means of quantificational, symbolic logic to dissolve problems of meaning, reference, and existence. In the second period, immigrated philosophers of the Wiener Christ combined the formal techniques of logic with the basic tenets of empiricism to rationally reconstruct a scientific conception of the world. For the logical positivist, analytic philosophy is a second-order discipline that has no material object of study of its own. For them, philosophy is a kind of handmaiden that rationally analyzes the first-order or linguistic activities of the natural scientist, explicating scientific concepts such as those of natural law and probability, and formulating a verification or criterion of meaning for claims to a posteriori knowledge are for them the central philosophical task. And now let's proceed to classical methodology. Analytic philosophers are united into one recognizable group not by a common doctrine, but by a shared methodology. They use a technique or cluster of techniques known as logical or linguistic analysis, or more generally, philosophical analysis. The adjective logical can get a strong or weak reading. In its strong sense, logical stands for analysis in terms of symbolic logic, whereas in its weak sense, it stands for analysis in terms of logical, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Below I come back to this distinction, but first I comment on the technique of philosophical analysis in general. This classical technique should be interpreted in the broad sense so that philosophical analysis not only includes the clarification of concepts, but also the evaluation of arguments. Hence, philosophical analysis comprises both analysis of concept and analysis of arguments. Besides aiming at conceptual clarification, the drawing of clear distinctions, and the avoidance of equivocation, analytic philosophy aims at the evaluation of arguments, logical rigor, and attention to detail in the steps of reasoning. In short, the business of analytic philosophy is conceptual analysis and argument evaluation. Correct reasoning involves good arguments. A good argument fulfills three conditions. First, it does not commit informal fallacies, begging the question petitio principii, attacking the man ad hominem, and equivocation are among the most important fallacies our reasoning should avoid. Second, a good argument is formally valid. An argument is valid when its deductive steps from the premises to the conclusion comply with the rules of formal logic. In a formally valid argument, the conclusion follows deductively from the set of premises. Third, a good argument is sound. A valid argument is not automatically true. Validity is not synonymous with truth, and validity itself offers no guarantee of truth. Validity is a property of which arguments, whereas truth is a property of individual premises and conclusions. Yet, logicians use the concept of truth to define the concept of validity. To say that an argument is valid is to say that if its premises are true, then its conclusion must also be true. So for a valid argument, it would be impossible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false. But an argument with one or more premises which are actually false and the conclusion which is also actually false might still be valid. The validity of an argument is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for its soundness. The soundness of an argument has to do with the actual truth of its premises and conclusion. A sound argument, then, is a valid argument of which all premises are actually true, and consequently, of which the conclusion is also actually true. Hence, if one rejects the truth of the conclusion of a valid argument, then one has also to reject the truth of at least one of its premises. In sum, analyzing or evaluating an argument involves a triple task. First, checking whether the argument commits informal fallacies or not. Second, certifying whether it is valid or not. And third, verifying whether it is sound or not. Sometimes, the demand for the truth of the premises will be too strong. In order to have at least a valid and plausible argument, one has to retreat to the weaker demand for the plausibility of its premises. The last part of argument evaluation calls for the technique of conceptual analysis. In order to verify an argument's unsoundness, one has to determine the truth and falsity of its premises. A premise consists of at least one sentence or proposition. Yet, in order to ascertain whether or not a proposition is true, one has to establish first its meaning. One cannot determine whether or not P is true unless one knows what P means. A proposition consists of at least two concepts, C sub 1, C sub 2 to C sub n. So, to establish the meaning of its proposition, one has to clarify first the meaning of the concepts out of which it is composed, and clarifying the meaning of its concept is precisely the business of conceptual analysis. Thus, the crucial question about an argument's unsoundness, about the truth value of its premises, give rise to other preliminary questions. First, is P true? Second, what does P mean? Third, what do P's constituents C sub 1, C sub 2 to C sub n mean? Prior to the question of truth comes the questions of meaning, with which conceptual analysis is occupied. Also independent of its role in argument evaluation, conceptual analysis can be used as autonomous technique for clarifying central concepts in philosophy, such as the concepts of knowledge, personal identity, moral rightness, and last but not the least, the concepts of education and teaching, as we will see in the next section. So answering the question, what does concept C mean, is the task of conceptual analysis. In the third period of the history of analytic philosophy, the one of direct relevance to analytic philosophy of education, the attention of analytic philosophers shifted from the ideal language of logic to the use of everyday, ordinary language as the instrument of analysis and clarification. In this post-war period, the technique of logical analysis acquired another identity. Instead of its association with analysis in terms of symbolic logic, the adjective logical becomes associated with analysis in terms of logical necessary and sufficient conditions. Analytic linguistic philosophy became synonymous with the analysis of ordinary language. This type of linguistic analysis is closely connected with conceptual analysis. Ordinary language philosophers are not so much interested in the vocabulary or grammar of a specific natural language. Example, English, as they are interested in the conceptual structure which different natural languages like English, French, and German have in common. They want to discover and systematize the logically necessary and sufficient condition for the application of a concept C by means of investigating the use of the corresponding word W in different contexts and at different times. This linguistic examination of what we do or should say when in using word W and applying the corresponding concept C is a good way to get a grip on what we do or should mean by the W and C. Thus, an analysis of concept C gives an answer to the question, what does concept C mean? Because it is an analysis of C in terms of its necessary and sufficient condition that specifies C's meaning. So, concept C applies to X if and only if such and such individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions are satisfied by X. The standard form of a conceptual analysis looks like this. If and only if. The first blank is called the analysandum, or the target concept being analyzed. The second blank is called the analysand, or that what does the analyzing, namely a set of conditions, each of which is necessary and which jointly are sufficient. If X is a necessary condition for Y, then Y is a sufficient condition for X. A necessary condition for C is something that must be satisfied if C is to occur. Only if such a condition is present, then C. For example, oxygen is a necessary condition for combustion. A sufficient condition for C is something such that if it is satisfied, then C will also occur. If such a condition is present, then C. For instance, having a daughter is a sufficient condition for being a parent. A conceptual analysis is then an if and only if or equivalence claim and thus a kind of definition. Take as an example the analysis of concept of bachelor. X is a bachelor if and only if X is a human, X is male, X is an adult, and X is unmarried. If one thinks that divorced men or widowers are not bachelors, then or should be replaced by the stronger condition X has never been married. Again, if one thinks that priests are not bachelors, then X is ineligible to marry should be added as an extra condition. Clear thinking involves concepts with good analysis. A good non-circular analysis basically has to meet three criteria. First, the analysandum and the analysans should be equivalent in meaning. This is evident. The analysand can involve neither more nor less meaning than the analysandum. Also, if the analysans would have another meaning than the analysandum, then the analysans could not possibly clarify the analysandum. Second, the analysandum should be more intelligible than the analysandum. The analysis can clarify only if the concepts used in the condition are clearer, or simpler, or more familiar than the target concept or the analysandum. Third, the analysis should be correct to test whether the analysandum and the analysans are really equivalent. One tries to give or construct so-called counterexamples to the analysis. A counterexample is a coherent or imagined scenario in which one side of the analysis holds but the other does not. For the most part, constructing a counterexample comes to the same thing as conducting a thought experiment. If a counterexample can successfully be constructed, then the analysandum and the analysans are not really equivalent. Alternately, if no counterexample can be constructed, then this failure is good evidence for the correctness of the analysis. Take as another example the standard analysis of the concept of knowledge. So subject S knows that P, if and only if S believes that P is true and S is justified in believing that P. Against this analysis of knowledge as justified, true belief, E. Gethier constructed counterexamples to sufficiency. A so-called Gethier counterexample describes a scenario in which S fulfills all three conditions but still does not know. B. Russell already gave the following case. There is the man who looks at the clock which is not going, thought he thinks it is, and who happens to look at it at the moment when it is right. This man acquires a true or justified belief as to the time of the day, but cannot be said to have knowledge. If the man has no reason to distrust the clock, his belief might be justified as well as true. Consequently, the JTB or the justified true belief analysis of knowledge is incorrect and has to be modified or expanded, if not abandoned. The necessary and sufficient conditions of the analysans are not empirical conditions. The conditions for knowledge, for example, are neither fully psychological nor neurophysiological conditions. Empirical conditions are a posterior discoverable and contingently true by using the methodology of conceptual analysis and argument evaluation. Analytic philosophers seek, in contrast, to discover a prior concept. Conceptual analysis is not based on empirical generalizations, but on intellectual scrutinization of conceptual content. To deliver a prior knowledge, conceptual analysis does not need the contribution of the empirical world. If the analysandum and the analysans are identical in meaning, then the analysis is correct or true by meaning alone. In a word, analytic philosophers are armchair investigators. Without being roused from their armchairs, they discover the essence of the world by analyzing the constituents of thought. Example, concepts. Let's now proceed to paradigm breakdown. But what exactly are concepts? Three proposals have been defended. Concepts are abstract objects or Platonic forms or Phrygian senses. Concepts are mental representations or ideas, and concepts are epistemic abilities. Concepposition is some sort of dispositional epistemic condition. All these proposals have ontological and epistemological difficulties, but more importantly, perhaps, it is even unclear how concepts are structured. The classical methodology of conceptual analysis assumes that concepts have a definitional structures in that their contents are definable by necessary and sufficient conditions. Alternative theories hold that concepts have a probabilistic structure, the prototype exemplar theory, that they are structured holistically, or the theory, or that they do not have any structure at all, or semantic atomism. All these theories about conceptual structure remain highly controversial. The assumption that concepts are definitionally structured by singly necessary and jointly sufficient conditions have received philosophical as well as empirical criticism. I'll leave the critical critic aside to concentrate on two major philosophical objections. It is alleged, firstly, the conceptual analysis cannot properly deal with functional or artifact concept or disjunctive concepts, like a strike in baseball, which can be either a cold or a swinging strike, and that it has difficulties with unclear cases, like is a tomato a fruit, but most importantly, it is claimed. Secondly, that conceptual analysis fails because it cannot satisfactorily specify the defining necessary and sufficient conditions. Wittgenstein made this devastating critical point. He asked, what is the conceptual analysis of, for example, the concept of game? What does fill the blank in the scheme? X is a game if and only if. So take the following sample of games under defining features, schematically represented as A, B, C, D. Game 1, example, board game. So A, B, C. Game 2, example, card game. B, C, D. Game 3, like ball game. A, C, D. And Game 4, like Olympic Games. A, B, D. If one looks at these different games, then one cannot find one single feature, F, such as amusing, competitive, or pastime that is common to all of them. There just is no necessary condition that all and only games satisfy. What one sees when looking at these games are similarities, overlap, and crisscross relationships. Such similarities are what Wittgenstein calls family resemblances, because the characteristic of family members overlap and crisscross in the same way. So games do not have a unique essence, but they form a family. Since the concept of game is a family resemblance concept, there is no feature F that can be specified as the necessary condition to fill in the blank of the scheme above. Wittgenstein generalizes this insight. If all concepts are family resemblance concepts, then conceptual analysis in terms of necessary and sufficient condition is doomed. However, some analytic philosophers take his pessimism to be uncalled for and argue that he is wrong. Logical analysis, either in its symbolic or conceptual mode, was for more than half a century paradigmatic for doing philosophy in the analytic style. From around 1960 until today, analytic philosophy witnessed and still witnesses a paradigm breakdown, caused among other factors by the anomaly Wittgenstein allegedly pointed out. The fourth period in the history of analytic philosophy is an era of pluralism and eclecticism. At least four strands are woven together. For one thing, weaker forms of conceptual analysis have been proposed. For instance, giving only some necessary conditions or only some sufficient ones, drawing up an open-ended list of criteria for the application of a concept, establishing coherent, mutually supportive connection between the central elements of our conceptual scheme. For another, new developments in symbolic logic, is particular the rise of the possible worlds approach to modal logic, reinvigorated the use of strictly logical analysis and formal modeling. In addition to possible world semantics, direct reference theory also made a significant impact. For still another thing, analytic philosophy became more detached from linguistic philosophy and loosely associated itself more with philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and even metaphysics. For a last thing, some analytic philosophers such as R. Ruthie, H. Footman, and J. McDowell returned to one or other form of idealism. Retreat from the foundationalist epistemology and realist ontology of earlier analytic philosophy is partly due to the growing influence of American pragmatism and postmodern modern anti-realism. So, what is analytic philosophy of education? The analytic turn. The two founding fathers of the analytic approach in the philosophy of education are Israel Scheffler, 1923 to 2014, in the United States, and Richard S. Peters, 1919 to 2011, in Great Britain. Although Scheffler published the Programmatic Manifesto toward an analytic philosophy of education in 1954, educational philosophy only definitely took the analytic turn some years later, around 1960, at the end of the third period in the history of analytic philosophy. The importation of ordinary language philosophy from mainstream analytic philosophy at that time really revolutionized the philosophy of education. Then let's proceed to exemplary analysis of the concept of education. So, though conceptual analysis is of central importance to analytic philosophy of education, it is not an end in itself. It is only meaningful if it's done at the service of problems that crop up in educational practices and policy. So, key concepts in analytic philosophy of education are, to name but a few, those central ones: education, teaching, indoctrination, curriculum, learning, development, and schooling. As an example of how the classical methodology is applied in the philosophy of education, I briefly reconstruct Peter's analysis of the concept of education. Take the standard format, analysandum if and only if analysans. What exactly is the analysandum? To make what is to be analyzed more precise, Peters appeals to Ryle's task achievement distinction, roughly a kind of process product distinction. Educational processes relate to be educated as tasks, internally relate to achievements. Being educated in the achievement of successful result relative to the performance of task activities, the realization of educational processes for convenience. I built the task or process aspect into the analysis of being educated. So, as is an educated person, if and only if S is in a desirable state of mind, which is realized in a morally and objectionable manner and partly produced by S voluntary intentional action, and second, S possesses knowledge that and understanding of the reason why, both of which are produced by S learning processes partly assisted by educational processes. In addition, 2a, S must take delight in knowledge and understanding for their own sake and must care about their standard of excellence. 2b, F knowledge and understanding must be sufficiently all-round and versatile. And lastly, S knowledge and understanding must sufficiently actively transform S attitude to life and the world. So, notice that 2a to see are additional nested necessary condition into number 2, which qualify the type of knowledge and understanding required for being educated. And then 1 and 2 are the two central necessary and sufficient conditions or criteria, the desirability or value criterion and the cognitive criterion. We avoid circularity in condition 2. Note the conceptual circle in the analysis. Educated, if and only if educational, by substituting educational processes with a plurality or more specific processes, such as given the inculcation of the basic skills of literacy and numeracy, instruction and correction, teaching and explanation, the dialogical method of questions and answer as well as conversation. Post-analytic era. A. Edel already in 1972 concludes his stock-taking paper Analytic Philosophy of Education at the Crossroads with the complaint that the analytic method only yields an unsatisfactory half-house because it leaves out empirical and valuational as well as socio-historical components of educational issues. In combination with the analytic paradigm breakdown at large, and the attendant anti-foundationalism and anti-essentialism, analytic philosophy of education, in the late 1970s came under pressure and lost its predominance. What is liberal education? As a further example of the analytic approach, it is worthwhile to briefly look at an analysis of liberal education and its justifications. This example highlights the important point that analytic philosophy of education is not limited to descriptive questions or conceptual analysis, but incorporates normative questions and justification as well. Conceptions. The ideal of liberal education is constitutive of European civilization from classical antiquity until today. So there are systematically 3 distinct conceptions of liberal education that can be distinguished. First, education for pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Then, general education and non-authoritarian education. So one way to sort out these conceptions is by interpreting liberal education as liberating education and to ask what such an education is liberating from. Liberal education, by its liberating force, wants to set mind free from certain constraints. The first conception wants to liberate from pragmatic instrumentalism and mere vocational training. The second from too narrow specialization and excessive compartmentalization, and the third from indoctrination and dogmatism. And lastly, justification. Although liberal education as general education clearly exclude narrow specialization, it is not clear what it positively includes. How broad must a person's spectrum of knowledge be for him or her to be called liberally educated?